All right, we're moving towards the end of the semester. This is lesson 13 out of 14. Um, these next two lessons are about advanced investigations. A lot of people would say, well, that's only for federal law enforcement, would be counter narcotics and counterintelligence. That's obviously not true. Throughout this process, it depends on local, state, and federal to work together on both of these types of criminal organizations to attack them fully and get a good picture of what's going on and really try to prevent these two scourges on American society. So today we'll be talking about a little bit about terrorism. We're not going to dive into everything. That's going to be really up to you. For your assignment is to get out there and research these groups and then try to take the little bit of framework that I give you during this instruction and put it to good use. I will warn you, there are 3 kids in this house. This is my 3rd attempt at this video because they keep busting up in here. I'll try to post those too. They're actually kind of funny, but they may interrupt, but I'm just going to have to roll with this one. So stick with me and we'll get through it together. So first thing I want to talk about is the definition of terrorism. A lot of people are very confused about what terrorism is. Sometimes I think the terrorists themselves are very confused about what terrorism is, especially domestic terrorists. We'll talk about the difference between domestic and international here in just a second. The political purpose of terrorism is to use these attacks, and a lot of times these attacks don't even result in anybody being injured or killed, but they're using that terrorism to instill fear into people to get a political purpose. A lot of people believe, and 9/11 kind of supported this belief, is that we need to kill as many people as possible. That's not really the case. It's not that they don't want to cause death and destruction, but it's just that they don't necessarily care about the end result of the attack as long as it instills the fear that achieves the political purpose. Okay, so when we look at really the definition of terrorism, it is violence carried out in furtherance of a political purpose. Okay, for a foreign organization, that's going to be something where we're operating in their land and they don't necessarily like it, and so they're going to try to be getting us out of their land. For a domestic terrorist, it could be a whole litany of things, usually very political in nature, and usually, obviously, your terrorists are not mainstream individuals. They're usually far left, far right. I actually heard something the other day where somebody said the political spectrum is no longer a line, it's actually a circle. And so there's a lot of things, and we're living at a time where there's a lot of people who believe that they need to resort to radical beliefs and radical purposes to get these things done. So terrorism is a very simply defined, but it's obviously a very complex thing to not only study but to investigate. Let's talk about the difference between domestic and international. Again, up front, it's pretty simple. A domestic terrorist is someone who's from the country that they are attacking, and an international terrorist is someone who's from outside of the country that they're attacking. And so, an example of a domestic terrorist here in America would be Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing. This is a guy who disagreed with federal law enforcement and how they were operating and how they were carrying out serving search warrants against people who were involved in these far-right militias. International terrorists, obviously, a good example of that would be Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda has been weakened by all of the operations in the last 20 years, but what I will say, they're still very much there, very much a threat to us. But I would suggest one of the things that you can go look at, to look at not only domestic terrorism, but really Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. And again, don't associate just the religion of Islam with terrorism. That's obviously a very faulty belief. These are people who are on the fringes of this religion who believe that jihad is a violent thing. Okay, so, but again, if you really want to get a picture of what foreign Islamic terrorists are, why they are doing what they're doing, you can go look at videos by a guy named Adam Gadahn. Adam Gadahn was an American-born Al-Qaeda operative who was pretty much the mouthpiece of the organization for a good 10 years until he was killed in in a drone strike, which was really a tricky instance for President Obama because this was an American citizen. But Adam Gadon can give you a good picture of what foreign terrorists are doing and why they are doing it. And it's easier for you to understand. You don't have to read subtitles. His references and analogies are things that we understand. Okay, so he's very much talking like he's from California, which is where he's from. So that would be a good way to look at international terrorism, and a good way to look at domestic terrorism would be Timothy McVeigh. Let's talk about lone wolf versus organized cells. So you've got the lone wolf attack. This is something that's really huge with domestic terrorism right now because they've started to realize that one of the ways that we're really interjecting ourselves is the communications between themselves and the command structure that's back in the country that they came from. And so they went to this lone wolf thing where they are, especially ISIS, is putting these videos and almost curriculum online of not only how to radicalize yourself, but once you have become radicalized, how to carry out violent jihad wherever you are. So it's incredibly dangerous. It's incredibly hard for law enforcement to track these lone wolves. I will say that if you go deep into the news cycle, you can see that our law enforcement community here in the United States is taking these people off on a regular basis. It just for some reason never picks up in the media. So they are able to intersect these people and try to get them before they do something really bad. On the other side of the lone wolf is the organized cell, the type of thing you saw in 9/11. There's a lot of people that would argue that this is very antiquated and that it's not effective. I would tend to agree with that. The organized cell that has a leader that sends reports back to the home country about what they're doing. That's really a recipe for disaster, just because of the way we've been able to do it. So they've really moved away from these organized cells, but obviously it's still a thing and it's still out there. So you've got to be when you start to consider this movement towards the lone wolf, and even lone wolf cell, 4 or 5 people that aren't communicating with people back in the home country where they came from, or any communications inside a domestic terrorism cell is done face to face, and you have to personally get in there to hear what they're doing. This is going to affect how you investigate. So when you get to your assignment, you need to keep this in mind. Are they more of a lone wolf, or are they still operating under the organized cells? And so that's going to be very important when determining how to investigate. Last thing I want to talk about definition of terrorism. How is this practical? How is all this practically carried out in the lens of 9/11 and really today now ISIS? When you look at 9/11, there were 3 to 4 cells who were operating here in the United States. They were operating under the guidance of directly from Osama bin Laden, who was very much a known terrorist to the United States. But prior to 9/11, and some of y'all may have been 5 or 6, it's hard to believe it's been that long ago, but prior to 9/11, we just didn't talk much about terrorism in this country. When you said the term terrorism, we talked more about places like Israel. Israel was dealing with the scourge of terrorism on a daily basis, so much as they are now. And so when you thought about terrorism, you didn't necessarily think that that's something that would happen here in our country. We were still dealing off. We still had the feeling that the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean that divide us from the rest of the world, like it did in World War I and World War II. We still kind of felt physically safe from this stuff, and obviously 9/11 undid all that, and we started to realize that domestic terrorism was something that we need to worry about. And just prior to that, the domestic terrorism, the thing through Timothy McVeigh, we started to realize that terrorism was something that was going to be part of our new world after 9/11. So practically, what they were trying to do, they were actually pretty good at it, to be quite honest. They were trying to affect our economy, and they were trying to pull our military into the Middle East so that they could be defeated. Okay, they believed that what they had done, one of the reasons they occupied in Afghanistan is because Afghanistan historically is an area that is not easily conquered. And so when you look back at what the Russians tried to do in Afghanistan, they believed that that would happen to us there as well. It's kind of interesting to see what currently is going to go on in Afghanistan. And the only reason we're there is because of 9/11. We wouldn't have normally went there after the Taliban unless 9/11 happened. Okay, so we went to Afghanistan. They knew that this would affect our budget for our country, and it did. and they knew that it would pull us into a long-term war in Afghanistan, which it did. People were still operating off of the ideas of success in 1991 against Saddam's army in Iraq. That was our experience in the Middle East as a people, and we fought about a 22-day war there and destroyed the fourth biggest military in the world. So everybody kind of thought that that's what's going to happen, and obviously Al-Qaeda and the people operating in the intelligence committee knew that we would be in Afghanistan for quite some time, trying to tame that region, because it's just one that's not been tamed. So practically, their purpose politically was to weaken our economy and pull our military into a long-term conflict. They did that. I wouldn't say that they were the sole effect on the economy, but it definitely pulled everybody's attention away from some things, and it had an effect. But I wouldn't say it had the effect that they thought. They thought that 9/11 would result in us pulling out of the Middle East and no longer being involved in any type of operation in the Middle East, no longer buying oil from the Middle East. I mean, they're way wrong on that stuff. So that's kind of what the purpose was. Did they accomplish their purpose? I would say, you got a little bump there on the radar, but other than that, it did not do what they thought it would do. But that's how you have to study these attacks. You need to look at their purpose. Is it domestic, international? Are they lone wolf or organized cell? And what is it that they were trying to accomplish? Okay, so let's look at whose job is it to fight these guys. And first off, it's going to be what's known as the intelligence community. These are 17 federal agencies that make up what's known as the intelligence community. It was formed in 1981 by President Ronald Reagan in order to try to say, okay, we've got 17 different entities out there developing intelligence against the Russians. This is not going to work unless they all talk. And so he did a good job of pulling the intelligence community together. And I would say prior to 9/11, that intelligence community was really still being put together. 20 years seems like a long time until you get to the age 40 of where I'm at. It's like, whoa, 20 years is pretty quick. So to ask 17 agencies to completely change how they operate, 20 years, again, is just a blip on the radar. That's really quick. And so prior to 9/11, they still weren't necessarily talking the way that President Reagan would have intended. If they had, I think we would have had a better picture. I don't know if we'd have stopped 9/11, but I think we would have had a better picture of what was going on. It's hard to say what would have been, but I don't think the intelligence community would disagree with me there. So the intelligence community is made up of three different entities. There's foreign intelligence, there's military, and there's law enforcement. So when we start talking about foreign intelligence, the first one that should pop into mind is someone like the CIA. A lot of people think the CIA is law enforcement. It is not. The CIA cannot operate inside the United States of America. They are a foreign intelligence service only. So that doesn't mean that you're ever going to go to court and somebody's going to be charged by the CIA with spying on this country. It doesn't work that way. They are a foreign intelligence service only. We start talking about military, we are talking about Department of Defense, and then under the DoD, all the departments, which would be the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, and our friends in the Coast Guard, which are responsible, kind of an odd entity in that they're a domestic military service, and they also report to the Department of Homeland Security. So kind of an odd shape there. Something that would be interesting to study for another class if you're ever called to. They also are kind of quasi-military and quasi-law enforcement. So your military folks are obviously going to be putting a lot of intel into this. A lot of your military are going to be carrying out operations as determined by domestic law enforcement or foreign intelligence services who pass that intel to the military, who are going to carry out operations in foreign lands. So pretty neat stuff. And then your last entity is going to be law enforcement, which is specifically what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So law enforcement specifically, a lot of people again think that terrorism is the job of federal agents. It is not. Local and state law enforcement agencies contribute very much to this operation. They had to, and that's one of the things that came out of 9/11. I actually wrote my thesis paper on local law enforcement's counterterrorism capabilities. If you think back to the definition of terrorism, I want you to imagine just a second, we're coming up on Black Friday. Imagine that a terrorist goes into a mall today, which would today for purposes of this lecture is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So a terrorist goes into a mall in Birmingham, Alabama, carries out an attack, and then this terrorist organization releases a statement that says, If you thought Wednesday was bad, you wait until Black Friday. Obviously, they're going to affect our economy. A lot of people, and probably wouldn't even have to carry out an attack, but there'd be a lot of people that would stay home on Friday and say, well, I'm not going to go Black Friday. Me personally, I'd go on Black Friday just to piss them off. I'm fine with that. So, but it's just one of those things where they're trying to affect that political purpose, and maybe their political purpose for that attack was to weaken the economy. And so that would be one way that you would think about an attack, and I want you to think about that from a law enforcement perspective. If you were a police officer in Birmingham, Alabama, on patrol at the mall on Wednesday before Thanksgiving, you need to be heads up. You need to be briefed on who are the current threats in this country. What are some things that they try to do? What are their current tactics? And so if you were to see somebody suspicious who possibly looks like they're getting ready to do this type of attack, you obviously need to be on your game. So local law enforcement is at the front of this thing, and they're also one of your main intelligence gathering entities. So you've got somebody odd that moves into a community. You need to be reporting those. You need to write reports on it and get it where it needs to go. And so local law enforcement, even in small towns and cities, is very much responsible for this fight. They're just as much a target as a big city. State law enforcement is going to be right there hand in hand with your federal agencies. I know here in Tennessee that the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation runs what's called a fusion center. I know that South Carolina has one as well. And in this fusion center, they're fusing all these reports from across the state that are local, state, and federal reports to paint a good picture, not only just basically for all of the entities involved. So that's going to be kind of your local and state picture, and then obviously your federal picture is going to be to do the prosecutions, to oversee these investigations, most of the funds and all those things. So when we start looking at this next point in the lecture of how to investigate it, we're going to be talking about task forces, and you've heard that term quite a bit, what a task force is. A task force is something that is put together, and it's going to be several law enforcement agencies, local, state, and federal usually. They're going to put this task force together, and they're going to have a very limited scope. Okay, in this purpose, we're going to be talking about terrorism. Next week, we're going to be talking about narcotics. So this counterterrorism task force, their job is to investigate terrorism within a very small jurisdiction. One of the best ones to look at is New York. Okay, New York City has a terrorism task force that's very focused, travels very light, and hits very hard. Really good task force. It's I haven't had a chance to look lately, but I'd say there's a lot of intel out there on the internet. You're going to need to research them and how they operate in order to complete your assignment this week. So there's a big heads up. One of the main ways that they do this is once the task force identifies an individual who that they know to be a member of a terrorist organization, they're just going to track them. They're going to follow them around. And a lot of people say, well, why? If you've got a case on them, take them off. That's pretty risky and pretty dangerous. Yeah, I would agree with that. So there's a lot of good discussions behind closed doors, I'm sure, of how long are we going to let Jim Bob here running around before he becomes too dangerous for us to let be out amongst the people anymore, especially since we're holding the case over here where we can put this guy away for the rest of his life. So you got to understand, though, once you've got that, I think it's what's called a red herring, you get this dude that you know is part of the organization, you want to track him. He's going to help you identify the other people. He's going to help you uncover plots, finance operations. The financing of these organizations is incredibly big. He's also going to help you uncover how they communicate. I mean, these are huge things. So that's one of the main methods of running these things. Obviously, it requires a ton of surveillance. And so doing car surveillance, on-foot surveillance, technological surveillance, you need to know where this person is at all times. Talk about exhausting. And so these task forces are going to be on surveillance 24 hours a day for weeks at a time, just following this person around trying to identify the rest of the organization. It's a tough job, not going to lie. So if you ever get into one of these things and you think this is what you're going to do, you need to be prepared to say goodbye to your family for weeks at a time, because you're not going to be home. You're going to be sleeping under your desk in the office. I've done it before myself, so it just kind of is what it is. And that's the peace you make with a job. You're also going to have another method, usually technologically driven. That's any investigation is technologically driven in 2019, and will continue to be for probably the rest of time. So you've got to be able technologically very savvy, very intelligent. That's one of the main methods of us uncovering plots, finance operations, and communications again. Uh, so what's the future like for counterterrorism investigations? Number one, just as we just talked, technology. Um, it's going to continue to dominate everyday life, and that means the same thing for the criminals as well. Your technology is huge, and so you've got to be able to operate with these different types of forensics. We haven't talked a whole lot about what these things are, but technologically, you need to be very sound. Will their targets shift? There's been a big push. There's everybody right there. We're getting ready to head to the doctor for strep throat, so wish me luck. But will their targets shift? Will they want to start hitting targets that are softer? Will they want to start hitting targets that are harder? There was a time when Al Qaeda attacked a military base. What are you thinking? They got away from that and they started hitting softer targets. Specifically, they started hitting targets internationally. They took advantage of the opportunity that our military was spread out across the Middle East and started just, you know what, we're going to attack Americans. Let's do it here in the Middle East. They're sitting right in our backyard, and they actually benefited from that in their mind. In my mind, they did not. If they're not here at home, I'm good. I'd rather them be in the Middle East. So that's kind of the big thing for me is what are we going to see out of, and not so much Al Qaeda right now. A lot of people are saying ISIS is defeated. No, ISIS is not defeated. That command structure is still there. They've lost territory, which I always thought that was crazy. When a terrorist organization starts to take land mass and say this is ours, that makes it very easy on our military. So they've lost all that land mass, and now they're just kind of traveling around in these little cells, which is very hard to uncover. But they're not very effective at attacking right now. So you can rest assured that they are recruiting. They are trying to adapt to their new world. They're not going to quit. Okay, that's just, you cannot end an ideology. It's not going to happen. Even if every ISIS member either went home or dropped dead right now, just they're gone. That ideology would survive on the internet, and somebody else is going to pick up that black banner and continue to move forward with it. It just is what it is. So we've got to look at the technology. How are their targets going to shift, and how are they going to continue to adapt to what it is we're doing? As a counterintelligence or a counterterrorism investigator, you have to be looking 2, 3, 5, 6, 10 steps in advance, and you got to understand every time you throw a pebble. Every time you throw a pebble into a pond, it has a ripple effect. Okay, and that's a doctrinal term here, the ripple effect. When you conduct any type of operation, investigative technique, interview, interrogation, you throw a pebble into a pond. When it hits the water and those ripple effects come off of it, what does that do? What kind of effect is it going to have on this organization? What kind of adaptation are they going to make off of that? You've got to be able to foresee in advance. Everybody wave, there they are. Little guy in the hoodie's not happy right now. There he is. All right, so let's talk about your assignment, and we'll be through with this lecture. I want you to imagine that you are an intel analyst for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Okay, really cool job. I actually was an intel analyst for a couple years of my career. I enjoyed it very much. I'd rather have carried a badge and a gun. That's kind of where I wanted to be. But being an intel analyst was a great job. It was my job to brief up the agents and have them ready to go, to let them know everything they needed to know. It was my job to suggest techniques to the agents. Of course, it was their decision of how they carried out and acted on any information that I sent to them. But it was my job to go through massive troves of information and to whittle that down until it was something they could use and then give it to them in an actionable format. Okay, so really cool job. You've got to be able to research. You've got to be able to write. You've got to be able to brief. That's one of the huge things is a lot of the intel analysts were people that wanted to sit behind a computer. Well, you're going to have to get out in front of the people and tell them what they need to know too. So a lot of people have to learn how to do that. So that's your job right now for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Your current task is going to be conduct a briefing to the special agents on how you best believe that they need to take down the current organization that you're investigating. The organization that you wrote about for your written assignment 13 is the same organization that you're going to brief on. So you wrote this paper that has all the information on it that the agents need to know. So you don't need to cover that in your brief. They've already read about Abu Sayyaf, Khmer Rouge, any of these, whoever you picked off that State Department page. Let's imagine that you've emailed that information. Okay, so they know about the organization now. Now you need to brief, how do we want to start attacking this organization? How do we want to severely weaken and disrupt their operations to the point that they're no longer effective? And I would argue that about ISIS right now, is they are not effective right now. Of course, they're going to be constantly striving towards becoming effective again, but law enforcement, or that intelligence community, has done a great job of weakening ISIS to the point to where they are on the run. Okay, so you're going to try to take your organization on the run, all right? So if you've got any questions on that, all you got to do is let me know. I'll be right here for the most part. If you need something immediately, please text, because over this holiday I will not be checking the email a whole lot. So looking forward to seeing what you guys got, and looking forward to next week, and then it's final time. Good luck.